Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little mysterious, but in a very calm, low energy, let's not get too worked up about it kind of way. So go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe lie back. Let your brain loosen its grip on the day. Because tonight, we're drifting into the slow, slightly confusing story of an entire civilization that just sort of stopped showing up. No explosions. No dramatic final battle. No official "we're done here" announcement. Just silence. And honestly, if you've ever ghosted a group chat, you might find this oddly relatable. Now, when people say the Mayans disappeared, it sounds like they all packed up overnight and vanished into the jungle like a historical magic trick. But reality, as always, is a bit less dramatic and a lot more slow, tired, and human. The Mayans didn't exactly disappear. They just unraveled. Gradually. Quietly. Like a sweater that no one noticed was coming apart until it was already mostly gone. Let's settle into that. Picture Central America, over 1,000 years ago. Dense jungle. Thick humidity. The kind of heat that makes doing anything feel like a mild inconvenience. And in the middle of all that, cities. Big ones. Stone pyramids rising above the trees. Plazas full of people. Markets buzzing. Rulers being, well, rulers. And like most rulers in history, they were very into showing off. Huge temples? Yes. Carvings of themselves? Obviously. Complex calendars and astronomy? Sure, because why not also track the stars while you're at it? The Mayans were doing quite well for themselves. Not perfect, of course. No civilization ever is. But organized, advanced, structured. Which makes what happened next feel a little awkward. Because around the 8th and 9th centuries, things start to shift. Slowly at first. Nothing dramatic. No big red warning light blinking over the jungle. Just small signs. A city stops building new monuments. Another stops carving dates into stone. A few rulers stop being mentioned entirely. And if you've ever watched a workplace slowly fall apart, you know the vibe. At first it's just, oh, that's weird. Then it becomes, okay, something is definitely off. Now here's the thing about the Mayans. They were very into writing things down. Not like modern journaling, but they carved dates and events into stone monuments called stelae. So when those carvings suddenly stop, that's not subtle. It's like someone who posts every day on social media suddenly going completely silent. No explanation. No goodbye. Just nothing. And historians are left staring at the timeline like, okay, so what happened here? Let's float gently into one of the biggest suspects. Overpopulation. Because yes, even in ancient jungle cities, people were very good at having more people. Cities like Tikal and Copán were packed. Not in a cozy way. In a we might be pushing our luck here kind of way. More people means more food. More food means more farming. More farming means cutting down a lot of forest. And forests, as it turns out, are kind of important. They hold soil together. They help regulate water. They make the whole living in a jungle thing actually sustainable. So when you start clearing them aggressively, things get complicated. The soil gets weaker. Crops don't grow as well. And suddenly, feeding your large, slightly overambitious population becomes stressful. Not instant disaster. Just a slow, creeping pressure. The kind that builds quietly. Now, let's add another layer. Because one problem is never enough. Climate. Around the same time, evidence suggests the region experienced several long droughts. Not just a dry season here and there. We're talking extended periods where rain just didn't show up like it used to. And rain, for an agricultural society, is basically everything. No rain means failing crops. Failing crops mean hungry people. Hungry people tend to get a little less cooperative. And you can almost imagine the conversations. Priests assuring everyone the gods would fix it. Rulers insisting everything was under control. Farmers quietly thinking, yeah, this doesn't feel under control. Because when your entire system depends on stability, and stability starts slipping, it doesn't take much for cracks to spread. Let's gently drift over to another issue, warfare. Now, the Mayans were not peaceful philosophers sitting around discussing the stars all day. They absolutely fought each other. A lot. City-states competing for power, capturing rivals, showing off victories. Classic elite behavior, really. And under normal conditions, that kind of conflict is manageable. Not great, but manageable. But add food shortages, drought, and overcrowding? Now it's a recipe for prolonged tension. Wars become more frequent, more draining, less about prestige, and more about survival. And the people at the bottom, the farmers, laborers, everyday folks, they're the ones feeling it the most. Because while kings are busy carving monuments about their victories, someone still needs to grow the food. And if the food isn't growing, well, the whole system starts to wobble. Gently, slowly, but noticeably. Now here's where things get a bit emotionally interesting. Because the Mayan rulers weren't just political leaders. They were seen as intermediaries with the gods. So when things were going well, great. Rain comes, crops grow, everyone's happy. But when things go badly, drought, famine, instability, people start to wonder, are the gods ignoring us? And by extension, are our rulers maybe not as connected to the gods as they claimed? Which is not a great look. Imagine building your entire authority on divine approval, and then nature just stops cooperating. Awkward. So now we have a situation where food is less reliable, wars are increasing, the environment is strained, and trust in leadership is slipping. And instead of one big collapse, we get something much quieter. People start leaving. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just gradually. Families moving away from cities. Communities shrinking. Centers of power slowly emptying out. Because at some point, staying just doesn't make sense anymore. And honestly, this might be the most human part of the whole story. No grand ending. No final stand. Just people deciding, yeah, maybe we should go somewhere else. And so they do. They move north, or to smaller settlements, or into areas that are less stressed. The big cities, the ones with the towering pyramids and carved monuments, they begin to feel quiet. Not abandoned overnight, just less busy. Then even less. Until eventually the jungle starts to creep back in. Stone buildings get covered in vines. Plazas fill with trees. And the place that once held thousands of people becomes still. Not gone. Just no longer central. And here's the part that often gets misunderstood. The Mayan people didn't vanish. They're still around today. Millions of descendants living across the region. Languages still spoken. Traditions still practiced. It's just the classic city-based system, the one with the grand monuments and powerful kings that faded out, which feels less like a disappearance and more like a very slow, very quiet transition. Of course, historians still debate the exact balance of causes. Was it mostly drought? Mostly environmental damage? Too much warfare? Political instability? And the answer is yes. Probably all of it. Because history rarely gives us clean, simple endings. It prefers messy combinations. A little bit of everything going wrong at the same time. And instead of a dramatic collapse, you get something softer. A long exhale. A gradual stepping away. Which, when you think about it, is almost more unsettling than a sudden ending. Because there's no clear moment where it all stops. Just a slow realization that what used to be there isn't quite there anymore. And as the jungle quietly reclaims the cities, covering stone with green, the story doesn't end. It just changes shape. And honestly, That might be the most peaceful way for civilization to fade. No final scream. No last dramatic scene. Just time doing what it does best. Alright, let's slowly drift from the humid jungles of Central America, and in the next part, we'll gently explore some of the more specific cities that faded away and how each one handled the long, quiet unraveling in its own slightly different, slightly human way. Alright, let's keep drifting. No sudden movements. No dramatic music swelling in the background. Just the same warm, heavy jungle air and the quiet sense that something important is slowly losing momentum. In part 1, we talked about the big picture. The slow unraveling. The droughts, the overcrowding, the kings who are probably a little too confident about their divine job security. Now, let's gently zoom in. Because civilizations don't collapse all at once. They do it city by city, person by person, decision by decision. And if we're going to understand how the Mayan world faded, we have to spend some time with the cities that used to be at the center of everything. Let's start with Tikal. Now, Tikal was kind of a big deal. Massive pyramids, towering above the jungle canopy, like they were trying to outgrow the trees themselves. A busy, powerful city that had been thriving for centuries. This wasn't some fragile settlement hanging on by a thread. This was a place with history, influence, and a strong sense of we've been here forever and we're not going anywhere. Which, historically, is always a slightly risky mindset. Because around the late 700s and early 800s, Tikal starts to go quiet. Not in a dramatic way. No signs of one last desperate battle. No massive destruction layer where everything burns at once. Just less activity. Fewer monuments. Fewer inscriptions. Fewer signs of royal life doing its usual look-at-me routine. It's like a city that slowly stops updating its status. And you can imagine the subtle changes. Markets that used to be crowded, now a bit thinner. Ceremonies that used to be grand, now a little less frequent. Construction projects that just don't get finished. Not abandoned, just losing energy. And one of the leading ideas here circles back to something we already touched on: water. Tikal didn't have a big river running through it. No convenient, always flowing source of fresh water. Instead, it relied heavily on reservoirs. Carefully managed systems to collect and store rainwater, which works beautifully until the rain becomes unreliable. Then suddenly, your entire city is depending on a system that's starting to fail. And again, not instantly, just gradually. Water levels drop. Storage becomes less reliable. And people begin to notice. Because when water becomes uncertain, everything else follows. Now, let's gently float over to Copán. Copán is interesting. Not just because of its architecture, which was detailed and intricate and honestly a little obsessed with carving things into stone, but because we have a clearer sense of its timeline. Copán kept carving dated monuments right up until it didn't. The last known dated inscription there is from around 822 AD. After that, nothing. And it's not like they ran out of stone or suddenly forgot how to carve. They just stopped, which feels oddly personal, like someone who always writes long messages suddenly replying with okay, and then eventually not replying at all. Now Copán, like many Mayan cities, was deeply tied to its rulers. Kings who traced their lineage, their legitimacy, their entire identity through a long line of predecessors. And when that chain weakens, the whole system gets shaky. There's evidence that Copán faced serious environmental stress, deforestation, soil exhaustion, population pressure. Basically, the land was being asked to do more than it comfortably could. And over time, it started to push back. Yields dropped. Resources thinned out. And maintaining the same level of royal grandeur became harder. Because those beautiful carvings and temples, they require labor. And labor requires food. And food at this point was becoming unreliable. So now we have a situation where the rulers still need to present themselves as powerful and divinely favored, but the material reality is quietly disagreeing. And that tension doesn't usually end in a neat, well-managed transition. It ends in slow erosion. Authority becomes less convincing. Projects stall, and people start to reconsider their options, which often leads to the simplest solution of all: leaving, not rebelling, not overthrowing, just leaving. And this is something we see across multiple Mayan sites. Places like Palenque, Caracol, and Calakmul, all of them show variations of the same pattern.
A peak,
A plateau, then a gradual decline. It's almost rhythmic. Build, expand, impress, then strain.
adjust, fade.
And the fading part is surprisingly quiet. No final dramatic gesture, just fewer people, then fewer still, until the city that once defined a region becomes a memory wrapped in stone. Let's linger for a moment on what that actually feels like, because it's easy to talk about cities in abstract terms. Population numbers, timelines, environmental factors. But these were people, families, children growing up in a place that used to feel full of life, slowly noticing that something is off. Maybe the festivals aren't as lively. Maybe certain buildings are no longer maintained. Maybe neighbors quietly move away and don't come back. And over time, the idea of the city as the center of everything starts to feel less convincing. And at some point, staying becomes a question. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet, practical thought. Do we still belong here? And more people start answering that question with, maybe not. So they go. They don't take the pyramids with them. They don't dismantle the monuments. They just step away from them. And the jungle, very patient as always, begins to take notice. Vines creep along stone surfaces. Roots find their way into cracks. Trees slowly rise in places that used to be plazas. Nature doesn't rush. It just reclaims. And within a few generations, a place that once held tens of thousands of people can start to feel distant, even to those who live nearby. Now here's something that adds another layer to all this. The Mayans had a deep relationship with time. Their calendar systems were complex, precise, and ironically very good at tracking long cycles. They understood patterns, repetition, the idea that things rise and fall, which makes the whole situation feel almost reflective. A civilization that carefully tracked time, eventually becoming part of a long, quiet cycle of change. Not a sudden ending, just a transition into something else. And again, it's worth repeating because this part tends to get lost in the dramatic retellings. The Mayans didn't vanish. They adapted. They moved. They continued. Just not in the same big, monument-heavy, king-centered way that we tend to focus on. Because those giant cities, they were only one version of Mayan life. And when that version stopped working, people didn't disappear. They just chose a different version. Which, when you think about it, is a very calm, very human response. Not heroic, not tragic, just practical, and maybe a little tired. Because maintaining a massive city in a difficult environment, under increasing stress, with leaders who are supposed to control the rain, that's a lot. At some point, stepping away probably felt less like failure and more like relief.
All right.
Let's slowly let Tikal fade back into the trees. Let Copán settle into its quiet stillness. And in the next part, we'll drift a little deeper into the minds of the rulers themselves, those carefully composed, divinely connected kings, and what happens when your entire identity is built on a system that's quietly not working anymore. All right, let's keep the pace slow. The jungle is still warm. The cities are still there, technically.
Just quieter now.
Less certain of themselves. And tonight, We're going to gently shift our focus upward to the people who are supposed to have everything under control. The kings. Because of course there were kings. There are always kings. And in the Mayan world, being a king wasn't just about sitting on a throne and looking important, which, to be fair, they absolutely did. It was also about something a little more ambitious. They were supposed to talk to the gods. Not casually, not metaphorically. Actually communicate. Perform rituals. Spill blood. Usually their own, in carefully dramatic but controlled ways, and in return, keep the universe running smoothly. Rain would fall. Crops would grow. Time itself would stay on track. No pressure. Now this works beautifully when everything is going well. If the rains come on time, if the harvest is strong, if the people are fed, then the king looks incredible. Look at him, people might think. He clearly knows what he's doing. And the king naturally would agree. More temples get built. More monuments get carved. More elaborate rituals get performed. Because why not double down when things are working? But now, let's gently return to our slow-moving problem. The droughts. Because drought doesn't care about your rituals. It doesn't check your calendar or wait for your ceremonies to finish. It just doesn't rain. And that's where things start to feel awkward. Imagine being a ruler whose entire legitimacy depends on keeping the gods happy, and then the sky just stays empty. Day after day.
Season after season.
The people are watching. Quietly. Patiently, at first. Any moment now, they might think. The king will fix it. And the king is probably thinking the same thing. More rituals. More offerings. Maybe more intense ceremonies. Because clearly something just needs a little extra effort. But the rain still doesn't come. And this is where the emotional tone shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly. Like everything else in this story. Confidence becomes strained. Certainty becomes a little forced, and people begin to notice. Not in loud protests, not in dramatic confrontations, just in quiet, internal questions. Is he still connected? Are the gods listening? Or have we been trusting something that isn't really working anymore? Now here's the tricky part. Mayan kings didn't have the option of saying, you know what, this is outside my control. That's not how their role worked. They were the connection. So if the system fails, it doesn't just look like bad luck. It looks like them. And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in. Because when your authority is symbolic and spiritual, you can't easily pivot. You can't just become a more practical administrator. You're still expected to hold the universe together, even as it's quietly slipping. Now, let's imagine a typical day during this slow unraveling. The king wakes up. The city is still there. The temples still stand. The rituals are still performed. But something feels thinner. Fewer people in the plazas. Less energy in the ceremonies. A kind of background tension that no one is openly talking about. And the king continues. Because what else is there to do? He performs the rituals. He reassures the people. He commissions another monument because appearances still matter. But maybe that monument takes longer to finish. Maybe the labor force is smaller. Maybe the resources aren't quite there. And over time, even the symbols of power start to feel slightly out of sync with reality. Now, in some cases, we see signs that things didn't stay entirely calm. There are hints of internal conflict, power struggles, shifts in leadership. Because when a system weakens, it rarely does so in perfect silence. But even then, it's not one big dramatic collapse. It's uneven. One city might hold on a bit longer. Another might lose its leadership structure more quickly. Some rulers try to maintain control through tradition. Others may adapt in small ways. But none of it quite stops the overall drift. Because the underlying problems, environmental stress, resource strain, population pressure, they're still there. quietly shaping everything. And the kings, for all their rituals and authority, can't really change that. Which brings us to a slightly uncomfortable realization. For all their power, they were also trapped. Trapped in a role that required certainty, in a world that was becoming uncertain. Trapped in a belief system that worked beautifully until it didn't. And when it stopped working, there wasn't a clear exit strategy. No official guidebook for what to do when the gods stop responding. So they continued, as long as they could, and then gradually they stopped. Not in a single moment. Just like the cities didn't empty all at once, the kingship itself faded. Fewer inscriptions, fewer recorded rulers, fewer signs of centralized authority, until eventually in many places, the line just ends. No dramatic final king standing alone on a pyramid, looking out over a collapsing world. Just absence. And honestly, that might be the most quietly unsettling part. Because we like endings. Clear ones. We like the idea of a final moment. A last stand. A closing chapter. But this isn't that kind of story. This is the kind where things simply stop being sustained. And once the system of kingship fades, the cities lose one of their central organizing forces. Because these weren't just political leaders, they were the glue holding together religion, economy, identity. Without that glue, things don't explode. They just loosen. Communities become more local. Power becomes more scattered. Life becomes less centered on grand cities and more focused on smaller, manageable spaces. Which, again, feels less like a dramatic fall and more like a quiet rebalancing. Not glamorous, not monumental, but functional. Alright, we're still here. The jungle hasn't rushed anything. The stones are still warm from the day's heat. And whatever used to feel urgent has mostly settled into something quieter now. So let's ease away from the kings and their increasingly awkward relationship with the sky and drift down to everyone else. The people who didn't carve monuments. The people who didn't claim divine connections. The people who just lived there. Because while kings fade and cities empty, everyday life doesn't just stop. It adjusts. Slowly.
Practically.
Sometimes a little reluctantly. And honestly, this is where the story becomes the most human. Imagine you're living in one of these cities. Maybe not right in the center, not in the shadow of the biggest pyramid, but close enough that you've always thought of this place as home. You've grown up here. You know the rhythms, the market days, the festivals, the familiar faces. And then over time, things start to feel off. Not alarming, just different. The harvest isn't as reliable as it used to be. Water takes a little more effort to manage. Certain goods become harder to find. And maybe at first you don't think much of it. Every place has its ups and downs. Seasons change. Things fluctuate. But then the downs start lasting longer than expected. And the UPS don't quite return the way they used to. Now layer in the subtle social changes. A family you've known for years quietly leaves. Then another. Then someone mentions that they're thinking about moving too. Not in a dramatic, we're abandoning everything kind of way. Just exploring options. Because when a system becomes harder to live in, people don't immediately panic. They start considering alternatives. Maybe there's better farmland somewhere else. Maybe a smaller settlement that isn't as crowded. Maybe a place where the water situation feels a less stressful. And little by little, the idea of leaving becomes normal, not a last resort, just one of several reasonable choices. Now here's something interesting. Leaving a city like Tikal or Copán wouldn't have felt like stepping into the unknown. These weren't isolated civilizations. The Mayan world was a network, trade routes, shared culture, connections between regions. So when people left, they weren't disappearing into emptiness. They were moving within a world they already understood. To relatives, to neighboring communities, to areas that had always existed just outside the spotlight of the big cities. And that makes the transition feel softer, less like collapse, more like redistribution. Now, of course, not everyone leaves at once. Some people stay, maybe out of attachment, maybe because moving isn't easy, maybe because they still believe things will stabilize. And for a while, those smaller populations continue. Life becomes quieter, less crowded, less demanding in some ways, but also less supported. Because large cities come with systems, organization, labor, infrastructure. When those systems shrink, everyday tasks can become more complicated. Maintaining reservoirs, repairing structures, coordinating agriculture, all of that requires people. And when there are fewer people, the burden shifts. At some point, even those who stayed might start to feel the same quiet pull. Is it still worth it? And one by one, or family by family, they make their own decisions. Not collectively, not dramatically, just individually. Which is why, when we look back, there's no single moment where everything ends. Because it never really ends. It just thins out. Now let's take a soft look at what happens next. Because this is the part that often gets overlooked. When the big cities fade, smaller communities don't vanish. They continue. Farming still happens. Families still grow. Traditions still carry on. Just without the massive urban centers dominating everything. In some ways, life might even become simpler. Less focused on supporting large, centralized power structures. More focused on local needs. More adaptable to changing conditions. And while it's tempting to see this as a loss, and in many ways, it is, especially if you're fond of towering pyramids and grand architecture, it's also a kind of adjustment. A shift from big and impressive to manageable and sustainable. Not as visually dramatic, but possibly more resilient. Now, let's imagine the emotional side of this. Because leaving a place like Tikal wouldn't be nothing. Even if it's the practical choice, it's still a change. You're leaving behind familiar spaces, memories, a version of life that once felt stable. And even if the city has already begun to quiet down, it's still your city. So there's likely a mix of feelings. Relief, maybe. Uncertainty. A touch of sadness. But also a sense of moving forward. Because humans are very good at adapting when they need to. Not always gracefully. Not always quickly. But steadily. And that's what we see here. Not a dramatic evacuation. Not a mass panic. Just a long, slow process of people finding new ways to live. And as they move, the landscape changes with them. The great plazas grow still. The temples stand, but without their constant activity. The roads that once connected busy centers become quieter paths. And the jungle continues its patient work. Not as an enemy. Not as a force of destruction. Just as something that fills empty space. Which, over time, becomes most of the city. Now, if you were to walk through one of these places a few generations later, you might not even recognize it as what it used to be. A pyramid half covered in vines. A courtyard now filled with trees. Stone carvings worn by weather and time. It wouldn't feel like a place that collapsed. It would feel like a place that moved on. Or maybe, more accurately, a place that people moved on from. And that distinction matters. Because it reminds us that the story isn't really about disappearance. It's about change. Slow, quiet, slightly messy change. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that you only fully notice after it's already happened. Alright, let's let the last few footsteps fade out of the plazas. Let the jungle settle in a little more. And in the next part, we'll gently explore how later civilizations and eventually modern explorers stumbled back into these spaces and tried to make sense of the silence that was left behind. Alright, let's keep drifting. At this point, the cities are quiet, not dramatically abandoned, just no longer the center of anything. The last families have made their decisions. The kings have faded out of relevance. The plazas, once full of voices, are now resting. And the jungle, very calm, very patient, has begun its slow, steady work. Because the jungle doesn't panic. It doesn't rush in like a dramatic movie villain. It just grows. A vine here, a root there. A tree taking hold in a crack that used to be part of a carefully laid stone floor. And over time, the shapes of the cities begin to soften. Edges blur. Walls sink slightly under the weight of soil and plants. Paths disappear under layers of leaves. And if you didn't already know something was there, you might not notice it at all, which is exactly what happens. For generations, these places don't vanish. They just become part of the landscape. Local communities still know about them, of course. They're not lost in the sense of being completely unknown.
People live nearby.
People pass through. But the grand idea of these cities, their former importance, their scale, their role as major centers of power, that part fades from everyday life. They become old places, quiet places, places you might avoid at night, not because of anything dramatic, but because they feel still, and maybe a little heavy with memory. Now, let's gently move forward in time. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall in other parts of the world. People argue about entirely different things. New maps are drawn. Old ones are forgotten. And in the middle of the jungle, the stones remain. Patient, unbothered, just waiting. Until eventually someone from the outside stumbles in. Now, this part of the story often gets told with a bit too much excitement. Lost cities discovered. That kind of thing. But in reality, it's a lot less cinematic. More like, a traveler hears about some ruins. A guide says, "Yeah, they're over there." And after a long, uncomfortable journey through heat and insects, they arrive. And what they find is confusing, because these aren't small ruins. These are massive structures. Pyramids rising above the trees. Carvings everywhere. Stones arranged with clear intention and skill. And the immediate question is, how does something this big just end up like this? Which is a very human reaction. We don't like quiet endings. We don't trust them. We want a clear cause. A dramatic reason. Something that explains the scale of what we're seeing. But what the explorers are looking at is not a single event. It's the result of centuries of small decisions, which is harder to process. So naturally, theories start to appear. Maybe there was a massive disaster. Maybe a sudden invasion. Maybe something mysterious and unexplainable. Because of course we jump to that. It's much more satisfying than, well, things got difficult and people slowly moved away. That answer feels underwhelming, and yet it's probably the closest to the truth. Now, as more explorers, archaeologists, and researchers begin to study these sites, the picture slowly becomes clearer. Not all at once. Just like everything else in this story, gradually. They start reading the carvings, deciphering the writing, understanding the calendars. And what they find isn't a sudden break. It's a tapering off. Dates that continue and then stop. Records of rulers that simply end. Construction phases that slow down and never quite resume. It's like reading a conversation that just trails off. No final message. No goodbye. Just silence. And over time, the idea of the mysterious disappearance starts to feel a bit exaggerated. Because the more you look, the more you realize. The people didn't vanish. The system changed. Now here's where things get a little ironically amusing. While early outsiders were busy discovering these ruins and wondering where everyone went, millions of Mayan descendants were still living in the region, speaking related languages, maintaining cultural traditions, continuing a long, unbroken human presence. So the real mystery isn't where did they go? It's more like, why did we assume they were gone in the first place? And the answer, as usual, comes back to what we choose to focus on. We tend to notice the big, dramatic structures, the pyramids, the cities, the monuments, and when those fall silent, we assume the whole civilization must have ended. But human life isn't only defined by its biggest buildings. It continues in smaller, quieter ways, which is exactly what happened here. Now, as research continues, a more balanced picture forms. Environmental stress,
drought,
overuse of land, political instability, warfare, all slowly interacting. Not one cause, not one moment, just a long, overlapping series of pressures. And under those pressures, the system that supported large, centralized cities becomes harder to maintain. So it fades, and something else takes its place. Not better, not worse, just different. And honestly, there's something almost calming about that, because it reminds us that not every ending needs to be dramatic. Sometimes things just stop being practical. And when that happens, people adjust. Quietly, gradually, without making a big announcement about it. Now, if you walk through places like Tikal or Copán today, you'll see the result of all this. Massive structures still standing. Stairs leading nowhere in particular. Stone faces looking out over spaces that are no longer filled with crowds. And the jungle, still doing its thing, gently wrapping everything in green. It doesn't feel like a disaster site. It feels like a place that has settled. A place where time kept moving, even when the original system didn't. And maybe that's the most important part of this whole story. Because when we say the Mayans disappeared, what we're really doing is focusing on the wrong thing. We're looking at the empty cities instead of the people who adapted. We're noticing the silence instead of the continuation. And in doing that, we turn a slow, human process into something that feels more mysterious than it actually is. All right, let's take a slow step back. We've wandered through the cities. We've watched the kings quietly lose their grip on the weather. We've followed the people as they made the very reasonable decision to not stay somewhere that was getting harder to live in. And now we zoom out. Not dramatically, just a gentle widening of the view. Because once you've seen how the Mayan cities faded, you start to notice something slightly uncomfortable. This wasn't unique. Not really. In fact, history is kind of full of civilizations that didn't explode or collapse in one big, cinematic moment. They just got tired. And yes, that sounds almost too simple. But stick with it. Because tired doesn't mean lazy. It doesn't mean weak. It means stretched. Overextended, overcomplicated, holding together systems that require constant effort in environments that don't always cooperate. And over time, that effort becomes harder to maintain. Let's think about it in a very calm, very low-energy way. Imagine running a household. At first, everything is manageable. You've got routines, systems, a rhythm. Then you add more responsibilities. More people, more expectations, more things that need constant attention. And for a while, it still works. You adjust. You organize. You keep things going. But then something small changes. Maybe resources get tighter. Maybe the environment becomes less predictable. Maybe a few key supports start to weaken. And suddenly, the same system that once felt stable starts to feel heavy. Not impossible, just harder. And that's where civilizations often find themselves. Not at the moment of collapse, but in that long, quiet stretch where maintaining everything becomes increasingly difficult. Now, let's bring this gently back to the Mayans. Because their cities were, in many ways, very impressive systems. Large populations, complex agriculture, political hierarchies, religious expectations layered on top of everything. It worked beautifully for a long time, but it required balance. Reliable rainfall, healthy soil, stable leadership, enough resources to keep the whole structure supported. And when that balance starts to shift, even slightly, the system doesn't immediately break. It just strains. And strain over time leads to adjustments.
People simplify.
They move. They reorganize their lives in ways that require less constant input, which is exactly what we saw. Now, here's where the slightly snarky part of history quietly leans in. Because while we like to think of ancient civilizations as fragile or primitive, they were often very good at adapting. Better, in some ways, than later societies. Because they didn't always cling to failing systems just for the sake of tradition or pride. When something stopped working, they didn't necessarily double down forever. Eventually, they just stopped maintaining it, which is a very practical decision. And maybe not the kind of dramatic heroism we like to imagine, but definitely effective. Now, compare that to how we often tell these stories. We like clear narratives. A great civilization rose and then it fell. Nice and tidy. But the reality is usually more like a complex system worked until it became too difficult to sustain in its current form, so people gradually shifted into something else. Which is a less exciting, but also more accurate. And honestly, a little more relatable. Because we all do this. We stop maintaining things that no longer make sense. We leave situations that become too difficult. We simplify when complexity becomes overwhelming. We just don't usually call it the collapse of our personal civilization. We call it moving on. Now, let's add one more gentle layer. Because there's a quiet irony in all of this. The Mayans are often remembered for their dramatic cities, the pyramids, the monuments, the big visible signs of power. But those weren't the most enduring parts of their civilization. The most enduring parts were the quieter ones. Language,
Culture.
daily practices, community structures. Those continued, while the big, impressive, attention-grabbing systems faded, which feels like a very subtle reminder. The things that look the strongest aren't always the most lasting. And the things that seem small often carry on much longer. Now, if we slowly bring this back to the present, not in a dramatic, this could happen to us kind of way, don't worry, but just as a quiet observation, it's interesting how often large systems rely on very specific conditions to keep working. And when those conditions change, even a little adjustments begin. Not all at once. Not loudly.
Just gradually.
Which is why the Mayan story doesn't feel like a warning. It feels more like a pattern. A very calm, very human pattern. Build something complex. Maintain it as long as it works. And when it becomes too much, let parts of it go. Not because of failure, but because of reality.
All right.
Let's not rush to any big conclusions. We don't need a dramatic moral. We don't need a final lesson. Because this story isn't really about a sudden disappearance. It's about something much softer. A long, quiet shift. From big to small. From central to local. From intense to manageable. And as we let that settle, the jungle is still there. The stones are still there. The descendants are still there. Nothing truly vanished. It just changed form. And maybe, in a strange, calm way, that's a much more peaceful ending than the dramatic version we usually imagine. So for tonight, just let that thought sit. No urgency. No tension. Just the quiet understanding that even the biggest systems don't always end with a bang. Sometimes they just get a little too tired to keep going. And then they rest. All right, let's settle in for one last slow drift. No big finale. No dramatic wrap-up. Just a gentle closing of the loop. Because by now, the pattern is pretty clear. The cities didn't explode. The people didn't vanish. The jungle didn't attack. Everything just shifted. And yet, if you open a book, watch a documentary, or scroll through a slightly overexcited headline, you'll still see the same phrase. The mysterious disappearance of the Mayans, which is a bit dramatic, understandably dramatic. But still, because at this point, we know better. The Mayans didn't disappear. They're still there. Still living across parts of Central America. Still speaking Mayan languages. Still carrying traditions that have been passed down quietly, steadily, without needing giant pyramids to prove anything. So, why do we keep telling the story like they vanished into thin air? Well, let's ease into that. First, there's the obvious reason. Ruins are very good at being mysterious. A massive stone city, sitting in the middle of dense jungle, with no obvious crowd of people around it, that feels like a mystery. It invites questions. It makes you pause and think, what happened here? And our brains, being what they are, don't love open-ended answers. We prefer something a little more dramatic. A sudden collapse. A hidden disaster. A single, powerful cause that explains everything neatly. Because a slow combination of environmental stress, social change, and gradual migration over a couple of centuries doesn't exactly fit on a catchy headline. It's accurate, but it's not exciting. And humans, historically, have a soft spot for excitement, even when we're trying to be calm about it. Now, there's another layer to this, and it's a bit more subtle. When early outsiders, explorers, researchers, travelers first started documenting these ruins, they weren't always looking at the full picture. They saw the cities. They saw the scale. They saw the silence. And they assumed that the people who built these places were gone. Which, in hindsight, feels a little like walking into an empty office building and concluding that the entire company has ceased to exist, without checking if everyone just moved to a different location. But at the time, it seemed reasonable, because the focus was on the big structures. And when those structures weren't actively in use, it looked like the system had ended. What they didn't fully account for was continuity. The idea that a civilization can change form without disappearing, that people can leave one way of life behind and continue in another, quietly, without needing to announce it. And once that early narrative of disappearance took hold, it kind of stuck. Because again, it's a better story, more mysterious, more intriguing, more likely to make someone lean in and pay attention. Now, let's add one more gentle observation. We tend to measure civilizations by their most visible achievements. The biggest buildings, the grandest systems, the most impressive displays of power. And when those fade, we assume the civilization itself must have faded too. But that's not really how human life works. The visible parts are often just the surface. Underneath, there's a much quieter layer. Daily routines, language, relationships, cultural habits. And those things don't require massive cities to survive. They can continue in villages, in small communities, in ways that don't attract much attention, which is exactly what happened here. The Mayan world didn't end. It just became less visible in the way we're used to measuring it. And that makes it easier to misunderstand. Because we're still drawn to the big, impressive, slightly dramatic version of history, even when the quieter version is sitting right in front of us. Now, if we slowly bring everything together, not in a rushed way, just gently, we started with the question, why did the Mayans suddenly disappear? And the answer, after all this drifting and observing, is they didn't. Not suddenly. Not completely. They just stopped living in a very specific kind of system. The large, centralized, monument-heavy city life became too difficult to maintain under changing conditions.
So people adapted.
They moved. They simplified. They continued. And the cities, without constant upkeep, slowly returned to the landscape. Which, when you think about it, is actually a very calm ending. No final scene. No dramatic goodbye, just a gradual shift from one way of living to another. Now, here's a slightly ironic thought to let settle in your mind as we wind down. The reason we're still fascinated by this story is because of the things that didn't last. The pyramids, the grand cities, the visible markers of power. But the reason the Mayan civilization actually continued is because of the things that did last. The quieter parts, the adaptable parts, the human parts. And those don't usually get the same spotlight. They don't rise above the trees. They don't demand attention. They just keep going. And maybe that's why this story feels a little different from the usual rise and fall narrative. Because it doesn't really have a clean ending. It just slowly fades into the present, which is, in its own way, a very gentle place to stop. So for tonight, let the jungle stay quiet. Let the ruins rest where they are. Let the idea of disappearance soften into something more accurate and a little more peaceful. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic, just time passing, and people adjusting. And if you listen closely, very calmly, very quietly, it almost doesn't feel like an ending at all. Alright, we'll keep this one soft. No new cities. No new theories. No kings trying to negotiate with the weather. Just a slow, calm moment to let everything settle. Because after all this wandering, through empty plazas, fading rulers, and people quietly choosing better options, we've ended up somewhere surprisingly simple. Nothing here really ended. It just changed shape. And maybe that's the part that feels the most unusual. We're used to stories with clean endings. A final scene. A clear turning point. Something that says, this is where it all stopped. But the Mayan story doesn't give us that. Instead, it gives us something softer. A long, gradual exhale. The kind you barely notice at first but eventually realize has been happening the whole time. Now, let's imagine one last scene. Not a dramatic one. Just a quiet evening, somewhere near one of those once busy cities. The air is still warm. The sounds of the jungle are steady, familiar.
A few families are still nearby.
Not many. Just enough to keep the place from feeling completely empty. And someone, maybe a parent, maybe a grandparent, is sitting with a child. And the child asks something simple. Was this place always like this? And the answer might be,
no.
It used to be busier. Not grander. Not more powerful. Just busier. More people. More noise. More activity. And the child nods. Because that's easy to understand. Places change. Things get busy. Then they get quiet. And life continues somewhere else. No mystery. No fear. Just change. Now zoom out just a little. That quiet moment, that simple conversation, that's the part of the story that doesn't get carved into stone. It doesn't become a monument. It doesn't get studied centuries later. But it's the part that actually carries the civilization forward. The small, everyday understanding that things don't stay the same forever. And that it's okay. Because humans are very good at adjusting. We don't always do it perfectly. We don't always see it coming. But we do it.
Slowly.
Naturally. Almost without thinking. And that's what happened here. The Mayans didn't vanish into the jungle. They became part of it. Part of the land. Part of the ongoing rhythm of the region. Not as rulers of massive cities, but as people continuing their lives in quieter ways. And the cities themselves? They didn't die. They just stopped being used. Like a house that no one lives in anymore. Still standing. Still real. Just no longer the center of anyone's world. And over time, the jungle moves in, not as an invader, but as something that simply fills empty space. Which, in a strange way, feels very calm. Very natural. Now, as we gently come to a close, there's one last small thought to leave resting in your mind. The reason this story feels mysterious isn't because of what happened. It's because of how quietly it happened. No single moment to point at. No dramatic turning point. Just a long series of small shifts. And we're not always great at noticing those. We tend to look for the loud events, the sudden changes, the big endings. But most of the time, life doesn't work like that. It moves slowly, adjusts quietly, changes shape without asking for attention. And if you're not looking for it, it almost feels like nothing happened at all. Until one day you look around and everything is a little different. So tonight, as you let your mind drift, there's no need to solve anything. No mystery to chase. Just a calm story about people who adapted, cities that rested, and a world that kept moving forward without making a big deal about it. No disappearance. No dramatic ending. Just time. And that's probably the quietest ending a story can have. So we'll leave it there. Let the jungle breathe. Let the stones stay warm under the night air. And let the whole story settle into that soft, steady silence. Nothing urgent. Nothing unfinished.
Just done.
Hey, if you're still here, just stay relaxed. No need to focus too hard now. This part isn't really about new information. It's more like that quiet space after a story ends, when your mind is still wandering a little. Because even though we've already reached the end, there's something about this kind of story that doesn't fully stop. It lingers, not in a dramatic way, just gently, like the feeling of a place you visited in your mind, and now you're slowly walking away from it. The jungle is still there. The ruins are still there. Nothing has changed since a few minutes ago. And yet it feels a little more distant now. A little softer. Maybe you can picture one of those pyramids again. Not sharply, not in detail, just the general shape. Rising above the trees.
Still.
Quiet. Unbothered. It doesn't need attention. It's not trying to tell you anything. It's just there. And that's kind of the mood of this whole story. Nothing is demanding a conclusion. Nothing is asking to be solved. It's already happened. A long time ago. Slowly.
Calmly.
And now all that's left is the space it occupies in your mind, which is surprisingly peaceful. Now, if your thoughts are starting to drift a little, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to hold onto every detail. You don't need to remember which city came first or which drought lasted longer. Because the point was never the specifics. It was the feeling, the slow realization that even something as large as a civilization doesn't always end in a way that feels loud or final. Sometimes it just loosens, and people quietly move on. And if you think about it, that idea shows up in small ways all the time. Places you used to go that you don't visit anymore. Conversations that slowly faded out. Routines that changed without a clear moment where they stopped. No big ending. Just less. Until eventually, it becomes something you remember instead of something you're part of. And that's okay. There's nothing heavy about it. Nothing urgent. Just a natural shift. Now imagine walking, not physically, just in that soft, half-asleep way your mind does, through one of those old Mayan cities again. But this time, it's not about history. It's just a place. The ground is uneven in spots. The air is thick, but calm. There's no rush to get anywhere. You pass by a structure that used to mean something very specific to someone. A temple, a gathering place, a symbol of power. And now it's just stone. Still solid. Still real. But no longer carrying the same weight. And you keep walking. Because there's nowhere you need to be. No one waiting. Just the quiet rhythm of steps that don't really matter. And maybe somewhere in the distance you hear something small. Not dramatic. Just a sound. Wind through leaves. Insects humming. The soft, constant presence of a place that didn't disappear, it just kept going in a different way. And that's enough. You don't need to analyze it. You don't need to turn it into a lesson. You can just let it be. Because at this point, the story isn't really a story anymore. It's more like a mood. A very slow, steady, almost weightless feeling. And if your thoughts start drifting into other things, random memories, half-formed ideas, the kind of quiet mental wandering that doesn't go anywhere in particular, that's perfectly fine too. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to keep following the thread. The thread has already been gently set down. Everything that needed to be said has been said. And everything that didn't need to be said quietly stayed in the background, which feels right. So now you can let the image of the jungle fade a little. Let the pyramids become less clear. Let the whole idea of the Mayans soften into something that doesn't need a definition. Just a sense. A quiet, steady sense that things change, and that's not something to worry about. It's just part of how everything moves. No beginning you need to remember.
No ending you need to hold on to.
Just a long, calm stretch of time doing what it always does. And if your eyes are getting heavier, or your thoughts are starting to blur a little at the edges, that's probably a good place to leave it. No final words. No big conclusion. Just a slow fade. Like everything else in the story. Alright, if you're still here, we'll go even softer now. This isn't really a next part in the usual sense. There's no new place to go. No new detail to uncover. It's more like sitting in the calm after everything has already settled. So just let your mind stay loose. No effort. No focus required. Because at this point, the story of the Mayans isn't something you need to follow anymore. It's something you can just sit with. That same slow feeling. Cities that once felt full, now quiet. Paths that once mattered, now just part of the ground. Voices that once filled the air, now long gone, without needing a final word. And none of it feels urgent. None of it asks anything from you. It's already complete, in its own quiet way. Now imagine, just for a moment, that you're not looking at the ruins as something from the past. Instead, think of them as something that simply exists. No timeline. No before or after. Just stone, trees, air, and stillness. Because the idea of collapse only really matters when you're trying to measure time. But if you remove that, if you let go of the need to know what came first or what came last, then it all becomes very calm, very even. The cities aren't lost. They're just not being used. The people didn't disappear. They just went somewhere else. And the jungle didn't take over. It simply kept growing the way it always does. Everything continues, just not in the same shape. And that's really the whole story. Nothing more complicated than that. Now, if your thoughts are starting to drift away from the details, and they probably are, that's actually the best way to experience this part. Because this isn't about remembering facts. It's about letting the ideas settle into something softer. Something that doesn't need to be held tightly. Like the feeling of a place you once knew, but can't quite picture clearly anymore. Not gone. Just distant. And that distance is comfortable. There's no need to bring it back into sharp focus. You can let it stay blurred. Let it fade at its own pace. Because just like the cities we've been talking about, this story doesn't need to stay active to exist. It can rest. Now imagine the jungle again, but even quieter this time.
No movement you need to follow.
No specific sound to listen for. Just a steady, almost unnoticeable presence. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty. It feels full in a very calm way. And somewhere within that stillness, everything that once happened is still there. Not as events. Not as stories. Just as something that was, and then gently became something else. No sharp edges. No clear lines.
Just a slow blending.
And if you try to hold on to it, it becomes harder to see. But if you let it drift, it stays. In that soft, almost weightless way. Now, there's really nothing left to add. No final insight. No hidden meaning waiting to be revealed. Because this was never a mystery that needed solving. It only felt like one because we expected something louder. Something more dramatic. But what we got instead was quiet. A very long, very steady quiet. And that's not something you solve. It's something you settle into. So at this point, you can let everything go. The cities, the kings, the people, the idea of why it happened. You don't need to carry any of it. It can all stay right where it is. And you can just rest. No questions. No answers. Just the same calm feeling that's been there from the beginning.
Slow.
Even. Unfinished in a way that doesn't matter. And if your mind drifts away completely from all of this, that's perfectly fine. Because the story doesn't need you to stay with it anymore. It's already done. In the quietest way possible.